The valley of Harlan's Crossing in eastern Tennessee sits between two ridges that run so close together in places that a man standing on the road below can block the sun with his outstretched hand. In the autumn of 1871, the road through that valley was unpaved, rutted by wagon wheels, and softened by October rain, and the only stone building within 12 miles in any direction was a Lutheran church called the Church of the Redeemer, which stood at the valley's northern end on a slight rise of ground that kept its foundation dry even in the worst of the spring floods. The church was built in 1843 by German settlers who had come west from Pennsylvania and who had brought with them a tradition of building in stone that their neighbours in the surrounding hills, mostly Scots-Irish and English, had neither the skill nor the material to replicate. The walls of the church were 2 feet thick, the windows were narrow and set deep into the stone. The ceiling inside was lower than you might expect for a building of that age and ambition, because the men who built it were practical men who understood that a low ceiling holds heat, and heat in a mountain valley in January is not a matter of comfort but of survival. The church could seat 140 people on its plain wooden pews. On most Sundays in 1871, fewer than 60 came. The keeper of that church was a man named Aldous Veit. He was 53 years old. He had been the church's sexton and groundskeeper since 1858, 13 years, and in that time he had buried 71 members of the congregation in the churchyard behind the building, had repaired the roof twice, had replaced the bell rope 4 times, and had kept a log of every significant event that occurred within the church's walls or on its grounds, in a ledger he purchased himself and stored in the vestry cabinet behind the baptismal records. That ledger is the reason this account exists. If you're finding this story compelling, hit the like button and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. It means a great deal to know who is paying attention. Aldous Veit was not an educated man in any formal sense. He had attended school for 6 years as a child in Knoxville before his father's death required him to find work. He read slowly and wrote with effort, but he wrote consistently, and what he wrote with precision. The log he kept at the Church of the Redeemer runs to 217 pages. It records weather, attendance, repairs, deaths, marriages, disputes, acts of generosity, and acts of negligence. It records the names of strangers who came to the church seeking shelter, which was not infrequent on that road in those decades, and what those strangers looked like, and how long they stayed, and what they left behind when they departed. The entry for the 9th of October 1871 runs to 11 pages. It is the longest entry in the log by a considerable margin. The second longest is 4 pages, describing a lightning strike that killed 2 horses and cracked the eastern wall of the church in 1866. The entry for the 9th of October begins, as all of Veit's entries do, with the weather. He notes that it had rained for 3 days prior, and that the road through the valley had become impassable for wagons above the second ford. He notes that the temperature had dropped overnight, and that there was ice on the horse trough by morning. He notes that he had arrived at the church at first light to check on a leak in the vestry roof that the pastor, a man named Gregor Harm, had asked him to address before the Sunday service. He notes that the vestry roof was sound, that the leak had not recurred, and that while he was checking the condition of the building's exterior, he found the north door of the church standing open. He had locked that door the previous evening. He was certain of it. He describes crossing the churchyard and stopping at the threshold of the open door. He describes looking into the interior of the church and seeing, at the far end of the nave, seated in the last pew on the left side, a figure he could not immediately make sense of. The figure was a man, or it was shaped like a man, but it was seated in a pew designed to hold 5 adults of ordinary size, and it filled the pew from one end to the other, its knees pressed against the back of the pew in front of it. Its head, when it turned at the sound of Veit's footsteps on the stone threshold, nearly touched the ceiling. Aldous Veit did not run. He records this fact himself, and adds that he does not entirely understand why he did not. He had served in the Tennessee Volunteer Infantry during the war, which had ended 6 years prior, and he writes that his experience of that service had taught him that the things most worth being afraid of rarely look the way you expect danger to look. What he saw in that pew did not look like danger. It looked, he writes, like exhaustion. The man, if that is the right word, was wearing the remains of work clothing, heavy canvas trousers of the kind used by labourers in industrial settings, a collarless shirt that had once been white, and a pair of boots that Veit estimated, from the distance of the nave, to be the length of a small child's forearm. The clothing was wet and torn in multiple places. The man's hands resting on his knees were the size of broad shovels. His face, when he turned it toward the door, was the face of a man in his middle years, perhaps 40, with a beard that had not been trimmed in some time, and eyes that Veit describes as the colour of iron left in rain, a grey so dark it was almost without warmth. He did not speak. He looked at Veit. Veit looked at him. Veit writes that he stood in the doorway for what felt like a long time before he said anything. Then he said in German, because German was the language of that church and the language that came to him first in moments of uncertainty, whether the man needed something to eat. The man answered in English. He said he would be grateful for anything that could be spared. His voice, Veit records, was low and even, and it did not shake. He had the accent of a man who had grown up in these mountains, not the flattened vowels of the deep south, not the clipped speech of the north, but the particular cadence of the southern Appalachians, a rhythm Veit had heard all his life, and associated with the families who had been in these hills for generations before any German settler arrived with stone tools and Lutheran theology and the ambition to build something that would last. Veit brought him bread and a jar of preserved pork from the vestry stores, kept for the congregation's poorer families and for travellers who arrived with nothing. He also brought a blanket, because the church was cold and the man's clothing was still wet from 3 days of rain. The man accepted both without comment. He ate in a manner Veit describes as deliberate, not desperate, the way a man eats when he has learned not to take food for granted. He draped the blanket across his shoulders and did not speak. Veit sat in the pew across the aisle and waited. He had learned in his years as sexton that people who arrived at a church in the state this man had arrived in would speak when they were ready. Pressing them before that moment made the kindness feel conditional. When the man did speak, he said his name was Samuel, no family name. He said he had been walking for 11 days, mostly at night, following the ridge lines south and east from a location he described only as near the coal seams above the Kanawha River in what is now West Virginia. He said he had worked in those seams for 7 years. He said the work was finished now, and so was he. Veit writes that he did not immediately understand what Samuel meant by this. He understood it only later in the context of everything that followed. Samuel had not left the mines of his own will. He had been released. There is a distinction, Veit notes, and it is not a gentle one. The log entry for the 9th of October then pauses and inserts an observation. Veit writes that he had heard stories, as most people in eastern Tennessee had in those years, of large men working the mines and railroads of the region. Not merely tall men, but men of a different order entirely, men whose size did not fit within the ordinary range of human variation. He had dismissed these stories as the kind of thing that grew in the telling. Looking across the aisle at Samuel, he stopped dismissing them. He estimated Samuel's height based on the proportions visible while seated at somewhere between 8.5 and 9 feet. He noted that Samuel's hands moved with the controlled precision of a man accustomed to working in confined spaces, small careful gestures from someone who had spent years learning not to break things by accident. This detail, Veit writes, stayed with him longer than the size itself. It was the consideration in those enormous hands that made Samuel feel, to him, most like a man. If you're finding this story compelling, hit the like button and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. It means a great deal to know who is paying attention. Over the 3 days that followed, Veit sheltered Samuel in the church without telling Pastor Ham. He brought food from his own house and told his wife Martha that a traveler had taken ill. She asked no further questions. Each evening, after returning home, Veit recorded what Samuel had told him by lamplight, from memory, in the log. Samuel had been recruited in 1864 by a man who found him in the mountains of southwestern Virginia, where Samuel and a small number of others like him lived in a hollow so remote that the nearest settlement was 2 days' walk in any direction. The recruiter came alone, on foot. Samuel said his people had taken this as a sign of reasonable intention. A man who came alone was a man who did not think he needed force. The recruiter represented a company Samuel knew only as the Concern. The Concern had specific requirements for labor that ordinary workers could not satisfy. Tunnels too unstable for standard blasting, seams too narrow for exhausted men to follow, timbers that no pulley system could place. Samuel's people could do these things. The recruiter knew this, Samuel said, because the Concern had employed his people before. The arrangement offered fair wages in currency, separate housing away from the main workforce, sufficient food, and at the conclusion of 18 months, transport home and a settlement payment. Samuel went. 11 others from his hollow went with him. The wages were paid at first. The housing was a series of reinforced structures built into the hillside above the mine entrance, accessible by a gated path. The gate, the supervisors explained, was a precaution against interference from the ordinary workforce. The gate locked from the outside. It took Samuel 2 months to understand that this was not incidental. By 1867, 3 years in, 4 of the 12 were dead. 2 in tunnel collapses never reported to any external authority. 1 from an illness left untreated for 3 weeks. 1 from causes Samuel described only as unclear, which Veit records without elaboration, understanding that some things are communicated more honestly by what is left out. The transport home was never arranged. The settlement payment was never made. When Samuel raised this with the site supervisor, a man named Greer, whose full name appears in Veit's log but cannot be confirmed in any surviving company document, Greer said the contracted work was not yet complete. Samuel pointed out that 4 years had passed beyond the agreed 18 months. Greer said the contract had been extended by mutual agreement. Samuel said there had been no agreement. Greer said a document existed, signed at the outset, covering all parties. Samuel asked to see it. He was told it was held at the Concern's offices. He asked for the address. He was told that was not information he was entitled to. By 1871, Samuel was the last of the 12 still at the Kanawha site. Some had died. Some, he believed, had been moved to other operations. In the spring of that year, Greer informed him the seam was exhausted and his services were no longer required. He was given 3 days' provision and pointed toward the road. No transport, no payment. Samuel walked south and east because north and west were the directions of the Concern's other operations. He walked at night. He had been walking 11 days when he found the north door of the Church of the Redeemer standing open in the October rain. On the morning of the 4th day, Samuel was gone. Veit arrived before first light and found the north door open again. The blanket was folded on the pew. No mark, no footprints in the frost. He walked the perimeter and found nothing. He stood at the door looking at the tree line. Then he went inside, sat across the aisle from where Samuel had sat, and remained there until the sun came up. That evening he wrote the final entry in his log, 3 sentences. The man called Samuel departed before dawn on the 12th of October, 1871. No trace of his passage could be found. The folded blanket remained on the pew for 11 days before Veit could bring himself to move it. The Church of the Redeemer was demolished in 1922 for a road extension abandoned 4 years later. The stone was sold. The log passed through 2 estates before reaching a regional archive in Knoxville, catalogued in 1961 under miscellaneous parish records and never digitized. The Kanawha operations of that period produced records surviving in partial form at the West Virginia State Archives. No company appears under any name matching what Veit recorded, no supervisor named Greer. There are 11 entries in the accident logs between 1864 and 1871, each marked specialty contractor, cause of death unrecorded. 12 men went in, 1 walked out. And somewhere past the tree line at the edge of Harlan's crossing, on a frost-covered morning in 1871, he kept walking. No record follows him, only Aldous Veit's log remains. Thank you for staying with this until the end. If what you heard here stayed with you, the other films on your screen continue the investigation. Subscribe if you haven't, and I will see you in the next one.